Hello, everyone. Let's continue this very interesting regulation and compliance track. My name is Marie. I'm with Commodities people. I look after our energy trading and commodity trading content in Europe. And I'm joined here today by a group of 3 experts. Thanks for being with us. Would you mind giving us a bit of an introduction of yourselves? Starting with you, Sid.
Sid Vidaver, the Regional Compliance Officer with Glencore, covering marketing and trading in the Americas.
Monique Kennedy, Global Head of Compliance, Engelhart Commodity Trading Partners.
And I'm Steve Mickelsen, the U.S. Head of Legal for Statkraft, and Statkraft's a Norwegian energy developer, and in the U.S. We have our legal and compliance functions are somewhat merged.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So in today's interconnected commodity markets, compliance isn't just a box to check, it's really a strategic imperative. As trading organizations expand globally, they face a patchwork of evolving regulatory frameworks, complex reporting requirements, and also diverse enforcement environments. So this session brings together compliance and legal experts to really discuss how commodity trading firms are navigating these challenges, basically by balancing, the global operations with local regulations and also building some strong compliance programs as well. So we will be leaving some time for Q&A at the end, so don't hesitate to make your question heard, basically. And before we start, I'd like to actually launch our first poll to you, the audience. So the question is, which aspect of cross-border compliance is the most difficult to manage? I appreciate you might want to tick a few, but think of the most. Just get to the QR code. If you can't get the QR code to work, you can just go to vivox.app and enter the ID. All right, so as you guys vote, I'm going to turn to the panel and ask the first question. I want all your opinions on this, but I'll start with you, Monique. What are the most common hurdles trading groups face when managing compliance across multiple jurisdictions, and how do they differ between regions and company types?
Sure. So I think when you're a small company like we are, I think that a huge hurdle is just coverage, right? Having the right team, the right coverage, and having the right reach, being able to kind of cover everything and cover it well, because the risk doesn't change because you're small. At the end of the day. So I think that that's it. So I think it's just really important to have just a really clear framework that is modular, actually, because there are differences, and I think that that's an issue that's actually increasing right now, particularly with the stance that the United States is taking from a regulatory perspective, where we're seeing a lot more kind of integration within Europe and more fragmentation in the United States. So I think that, having the right team in place with clear responsibility lines, clear reporting, a clear plan, and constant communication with the businesses to understand ahead of time and early where are we going and what are our business objectives to make sure that the compliance plan matches the objectives. Being nimble, being informed, and just being structured is key.
Okay, interesting. Stephen, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. And I would agree with what Monique said. And I would say that is one of the challenges, too, is that compliance is a very local function inherently because you're trying to comply with local regulations and trying to meet what your local regulator is requesting of you. But when you're in a large multinational organization, you also have global policies. And so there's this conflict between you may have someone who may be a global head of compliance, but they almost naturally come from one of your major jurisdictions, but don't necessarily have the expertise, because no one could have a global compliance expertise where they could be an expert in every conceivable situation that could come up. And so you have to put in place systems in order to be able to manage that complexity. And there's really I don't know if there's a way completely out of the box, because ultimately you have this conflict. You may have, do we want to apply the same policy across the entire organization, in which case you could be either under compliant if you're if your head, for example, has a certain background, they may not understand some additional obligation in a smaller jurisdiction, or you could be over-compliant in the sense that you're handicapping your business functions because you've created a policy that requires over-compliance, and you could actually have an issue with your own regulator because even though you may not have violated some regulatory obligation, they may look at your policy, or an auditor may look at your policy and say your policy requires you to do a certain thing, and to the people in the local jurisdiction, that may not seem like a sensible way to approach it. So I think the biggest challenge that I would see is trying to manage the issues of compliance being a local function, but also the need for global management in order to maintain consistent standards across the organization.
All right, Sid?
And just to, excuse me, just to echo these thoughts for those of us that work in multinational companies, in a remote office in the multinational company, very typically your home office is going to be highly resourced. Your regional office will not be. Your home office may have a very siloed approach to these risks. You cannot afford to. You have to have a holistic approach, and finding people, finding a way to convey the holistic nature of these risks into the home office can always be simply a challenge of time, resources, and also expertise.
Very good point. Let's put up the results if we can. Let's see what our audience have replied. So yeah, the first one, half of the people think regulatory inconsistencies and divergence are the biggest challenge. Okay, well, hopefully some of the things we'll say later on will be of help. So moving on to the next question, and precisely to regulatory divergence. How can a firm effectively navigate varying regulatory frameworks and reconcile conflicting requirements between different countries? That question is for you, Stephen.
Yeah, so I think that what you're going to do is you need to rely on your local experts, and if you don't have local experts in-house, then there are plenty of highly skilled law firms and consultants who can help you create a local plan. Then you have to have someone who has the ultimate visibility and responsibility across the jurisdictions to try to approve that plan. One issue that comes up is what I would call accountability sinks, where you could have large organizations somewhat naturally tend towards accountability sinks, which means you have a decision that was made by nobody. And you can have that situation where you may have, one person may say, well, it was someone else, the policy may be in my name, but it was someone else who specifically requested that this particular section be put in or that this particular process be observed. And so you have to try to mitigate those accountability sinks by ensuring that the person who is accountable for that action knows they're accountable and feels appropriately empowered to follow up with the local experts who will necessarily be the ones who are the closest to the activity and probably can identify situations where the policy may be either adhered to in name but not necessarily in scope, or else in scope but not in name. And so I think the way you have to manage is having a person who has who's been entrusted by the board, by the executives, in order to be that expert across the organization, and then to rely on local experts to supplement their knowledge.
Right, thank you. Well, to stay on the divergence of regulation topic, the data protection policies are actually a good example that we discussed during our prep call. So, Sid, I want to ask you, could you tell us how you manage such varied levels of regulations in that space?
So I know this is a commodities group and people want to hear about divergences in commodities, but sometimes data protection is actually one of the more fundamental areas to look at, especially if you're working in a European organization where data protection is oftentimes as high risk from a regulatory perspective as commodities trading. So as far as that coordination goes, you need to work with obviously your home office to get a general approach. You need to determine any local regulations that you may have. We are sitting here in the US, so we don't have a true federal law, though there are different state rules that do impact or may impact your business depending on how you are using the data that you do have available to you. Other areas then to be mindful of are just simply beyond, may go beyond a mere data protection rule or policy, are your internal IT rules, and simply enforcing those. while being mindful then as well of just some of the classic bread and butter considerations with data protection, your retention and destruction procedures. There's almost nothing more fatal to a company in an enforcement action than failing to actually abide by your own retention and destruction procedures. It can open up the world of discovery to, much broader than anyone would have anticipated, and call into question the general effectiveness of the implementation of your compliance program.
I think it's also important to have partnerships with other departments within the company. HR, particularly when you're talking about data privacy, HR is a core ally in terms of enforcing that and working to respond to requests, which can be plentiful if you're dealing with a European office. And then also IT, because IT, I'm kind of dividing between sort of data protection, which can include things like our internal secrets strategies, things like that, that we do want to protect. And so having a very clear and regular kind of surveillance plan in place to protect company data is important, which is important to work with IT. And then also with HR in terms of when people come in, they may bring intellectual property with them. They may want to talk about how that intellectual property is treated. So it's also, so that kind of core, we've established as an example a data protection working group within our company where we meet and we talk about things like data privacy, but also data security.
These are very good points. And staying on the sort of organizational challenges, how do you address potential conflicts internally, between legal, risk, compliance? Could you tell us a bit more about that? Again,
having sort of core, I think, core kind of management groups. That I think it's a governance issue, really, and having governance with respect to having kind of multiple teams covering certain issues. We have an operating committee meeting that's periodic operating committee meetings really focusing on back office. We have committees focusing on front office issues. And I think that when these kinds of conflicts come up, they need discussion. Certain times the compliance risk may be murky. And the business objective is the one that wins the day, ultimately. And so it's important to make sure that these kinds of issues are discussed so that decisions are made with full awareness of potential impacts and that can be defended. Because again, if there is a risk and you're knowingly taking that risk, you better be prepared to document it and defend it if you're challenged with respect to that risk as well. So that governance piece is key.
Yeah, and I would add that I think this is an area where culture is especially important, where you want to create, I would say, a culture of trust as opposed to a culture of suspicion. I heard recently someone said, I forget who said it, but it was if you have impossible standards, you are inviting unethical behavior. And I think that as an organization, it's from the management, it's very easy to say, we need to, whether it's hit a quarterly number or whatever it is, hit certain KPIs that we expect our managers to hit in order to, meet some ultimate goal. I think that a lot of times when the role of management in the middle from, between the capital class, which is the shareholders, and the labor class, which is the employees. In the middle, you have the management class. The role of the management class is to take those goals from effectively the capital class and to socialize them and create a culture within the organization to where people are incentivized to bring forth concerns that they have. There is no compliance program that has perfect oversight. Your best oversight is your people, and I think that you want to build trusting relationships. It helps to get on airplanes. I'm based in San Francisco, and I'm here in the New York and Stanford offices talking to people because I want them to know to put a face to our compliance policies and put a face to me, so that when an issue comes up, they don't say, "Well, I don't even know who Steve is. I've never sent him an email before, so why would I send him one now?" But instead, you need to create a situation where people are not going to be stigmatized if they're the one to raise an issue, or you're not going to point the finger at them and say, well, why didn't you fix this sooner? Because we all make mistakes and we all lose track of things in our job. And so if you have a culture where people trust each other and they're looking out for the person next to them to say, well, I don't want to throw Steve under the bus, so I will, or the compliance team under the bus, or, you know, Marek is our compliance head who's based in Germany. I don't want to throw those people under the bus. Then I think you can you create a situation where you are more likely to have people come to you to bring you concerns, so that then you're able to, in some cases, you know, adapt your policy. If people have a reasonable concern when they say, you know what, the business can't operate in this way, then sometimes it makes sense to adapt your policy to say, you know what, there is an alternative path to compliance, because you want to build trust instead of just saying, this is, you know, here's a, you know, 40-page PDF, it's on the company intranet, you know, read it, understand it, live by it, and then sign your name to it, which is what a lot of organizations, actually I think every organization does that in some way, but it's like you have to somehow socialize both the policy and as well as create the culture behind the policy of what you're trying to achieve in a way that resonates with people, instead of just saying, here's a list of rules of things you aren't allowed to do.
Yeah, I think compliance culture is one big important factor, and we actually have a question for the audience on that topic. So we will ask of you to actually write an answer if you can. So the question is, what's the most important factor in establishing a compliance culture? Which is even more critical when you have global functions, like global presence, obviously. So let's see what sort of results we get. Well, as we wait for the answers to come in, I want to ask Monique. Oh, okay, sorry. Tone from the top. Okay. Well, I give you the opportunity to put it in, and in the meantime, we'll hear from Monique about, you know, what sort of challenges do you face in terms of compliance culture when you have a global footprint? You know, how do you create really a single, you know, culture across multiple geographies?
Right, sure. So obviously, tone from the top, management support, buy-in, those are the top three things, and that's true. But I think that compliance culture, there's sort of the individual responsibility and sort of the structural setup, and I like structure in a sense. So having structure, having a governance structure that facilitates communication across management, and then facilitates communication from management to down is really key. So having that structure that allows, so some people are just naturally gifted at sort of getting on the plane, getting around, chatting with people. But if you don't have a structure, only some people will do that. If you do have a structure that requires people to do that, everyone will do it. And there'll be more communication across the top.
Sid, did you want to add something?
What I always like to add to this particular part of the conversation is everyone says tone from the top. It is correct, of course. But as important, and what usually gets lost in the muddle of this, particularly to your point of talking about management culture, is the mood in the middle.
Yeah.
And that is, your leaders can say something. If your junior ranks are not seeing those values lived by their immediate managers, they will be cynical, and they will reject any new initiative as being earnest, and it will undermine the effectiveness of the program. And so a lot of these programs focus and tone at the top. Part of your conveying of the message to the top is that they have to drill this in with their immediate people underneath as well. It's not just a code of conduct annual training that goes out via an e-learning. It needs to be more.
Stephen?
So I think that cynicism can be especially destructive there, because, and I think I've seen it in many organizations where anything that comes from management, people kind of immediately kind of snicker, and especially they may have perhaps justifiably feel a bit put upon if they see management not living by the same code. If they see whether it's, an expense policy and, management stays at the 5-star hotels and tells everyone else to stay at the 3-star, whatever it could be, there kind of creates a distrust and a sense of the policy is whatever is enforced and whatever I can get away with, as opposed to having a sincere desire to live within the policy because I trust the people next to me and I want to help their success because their success is my success. And I think there can be a difference between, I believe in, service-based organizations as being the most sustainable path for an organization. And I think especially if you're in a legal or compliance role, you're effectively in a service-based role. And to the extent that you can create and embody that culture, I think it can help to try to chip away at some of the cynicism where people may just say, it's my job is to actually help people achieve their goals as opposed to just purely achieving my goal and looking at everyone else in the organization as someone who's there to achieve my goal. It's about the organization as a whole and helping the people who are to your right and your left achieve their goals.
And just to add one last thing, transparency is core to trust. So, if management's going off in these meetings and they're not actually taking the messaging that they're getting from these meetings and channeling it down, then you're not going to have that trust. You will have that snickering because people are not going to, they're just going to assume that there's this big kind of amorphous decision maker at top and they're just putting in their time. And then also, listen, encouraging people to speak up, right? Not killing the messenger. Acknowledging people make mistakes, not killing them for doing it, but making mistakes learning opportunities and openly discussing them, sharing your own mistakes. So these are the kinds of things that I think also go into more of the culture, and it's an overall culture. We always say compliance is not we do, it's how we do everything, right? So it's not just that the compliance department that's responsible for culture, it's the entire company culture. And that's something that is sustained by, again, transparent governance, strong HR, strong compliance and legal and constant communication, which can be annoying, but it's a good thing.
Just wanted to say that there, just to clarify. So we talked a lot about the sort of human aspect of this, but what about technology? What is the role of technology in sort of helping you staying compliant across different geographies, different jurisdictions? Sid, do you want to venture an answer to that?
Well, so actually have some of the members of our market conduct team here. Particular market conduct, you need to be mindful, like there is absolutely a place, it's a necessary place for surveillance. Mm-hmm. You have to be mindful of both communication surveillance as well as transactional surveillance. Some of those issues are harder than others, obviously. Some markets are harder than others. Some geographies are harder than others. And you need to really work with outside counsel, your local resources, your IT departments, your risk departments, and the businesses on understanding all of these issues. Speaking from a vantage point of not Glencore, but another organization I worked in, they had done very little messaging around communication surveillance. Now they had, in fact, undergone all of the relevant controls and reviews with outside counsel. And so when they were going to a European office and telling people that, yes, we will be surveilling your communications, it was, let's just say, poorly received. And it's those, and there may never be a good way to fully message that. Some people are, 80-20 rule. You're always going to have people who will poorly receive any message that you ever want to convey. You have to discount those people, but you really want that 80% to understand it and to take it forward as to the importance of that.
Anything to add on the technology side? We can go to the next topic of discussion, enforcement, which is a big part of the role, obviously. So let's talk about the relationship with regulators for a moment. The perception of the regulatory bodies is not the same across the different geographies and across industries, actually. So why is that, and how can you make sure this doesn't, negatively impact your compliance function? Sid, that one is for you as well. First.
Internally and externally, one needs to always appreciate enforcement culture, both internally and externally. Different regulators have different enforcement cultures. Again, not at Glencore. I remember once being in an organization that had a very strong banking compliance culture. They understood how a banking regulator might respond to a breach, how those issues should be advanced. When you have encountered a difficulty of implementing a program, how you may want to approach a specific banking regulator. This strategy was radically different from how the CFTC at the time expected to be consulted in the event of a breach. And so they drafted, so when they were running very far behind on their trade reporting methodologies, they simply drafted a one-page letter to the CFTC informing them that they're having troubles, they're on it, and they'll let them know when they're in compliance. And
How'd that go?
I want to hear the next part of the story.
And in the end, there was an in-person meeting at the CFTC where we conveyed our seriousness in our approach, and the CFTC heard us. But it resulted in what I refer to that as a peacekeeping mission. And so conveying the difference and appreciating the difference in regulatory culture. Europe is different from, different, like the FCA is very different from, from the DOJ. The SFO has its own culture different from the DOJ. You have to appreciate that just the difference in these areas and your geographies and why certain things may matter. I once had to explain to a colleague in Europe that sending out a procedure and training in English only across Quebec was not merely a faux pas. It actually was also a violation. And just simply, knowing your audience, but one of your audiences is your regulator.
Anything to add on that, Monique?
Local expertise is core there. I mean, you just need to have, sorry, I knew this was going to happen. Local expertise is really important. So making sure that you have your go-to experts with respect to each regulator. And I think there, and the other thing too is also kind of industry practice is also different. Physical traders are also very different from financial traders. Energy is different from gas. Power is definitely different from gas in terms of the appetite for dealing with regulators. And so it's just really important to sort of recognize that there are kind of cultural, not just regulatory differences, but sort of industry cultural differences as well. And you can only do that by having trusted advisors with respect to each of the agencies that you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And I'll add that for this is before so Statkraft were a Norwegian state-owned entity. Prior to Statkraft, I had worked with U.S. organizations that may have had satellite offices abroad. And one thing I noticed within Statkraft, Norwegian, Nordic, Scandinavian culture is, kind of notorious as being a high trust culture. That's why they do really well in the happiness surveys. Where are the happiest people in the world? Well, they're in Finland or wherever. It's cold and miserable to most people, but the people are happy. And part of the reason is there's this sense of social cohesion that I think is quite enviable. And there is a trust of your elected official to think that elected official will act in the best interest of the polity, as opposed to trying to find ways for personal gain. I think that also applies to a regulator, that the regulator will be attempting to try to ensure that the market is operating in an efficient manner and not necessarily be punitive and try to have, a plaque on their wall saying that I took down this really large company, securing the largest fine in my organization's history, which is a certain cynical view I've heard of certain U.S. regulators, not the agency themselves, but individuals within them. And so when, kind of I thought about, Sid's self-reporting question and say, well, do we tell the CFTC, what we've done, or do we hope they'll never figure out, or do we find some middle ground? And I've found amongst my European colleagues is there is I would say a greater bias towards engaging with the regulator, even in a situation where you may not have an explicit legal obligation to engage. And that's something that, we've discussed, internally at various times to say, well, what situations is, when should you engage with the regulator? And I find that culturally, at least amongst a lot of the people I work with, there is a stronger, work on the European side, there can be a stronger desire to engage with the regulator, because I think it ultimately comes down to there's a certain social trust that's higher in certain jurisdictions than it is other, even aside from, what you might objectively say is the regulator's expected behavior as a regulator.
I just want to add one other thing. So industry groups are also really important, particularly for smaller players. As someone that is, we've got a company, 450 people, we're not going to move the needle. But when we work with other industry groups, we have better understanding, better leverage, and better networking capability with regulatory agencies as well. And there's strong industry groups in Europe as well as in the U.S.
Yeah, and I'll add on what Monique said. Is I think that's that's absolutely true. Is someone who is in some ways handling a lot of things myself. It's great. Industry groups are great for being able to see how other equivalent peers may handle it in a way that's very somewhat social and more informal, to kind of do a level set on where we are, and really to borrow from the expertise of others. And also it can be helpful too when it comes to regulatory comment writing. You don't always want to put your firm's letterhead on the bottom of a letter that says that agency, you've gotten it wrong, you should change your rule in a way that's going to make us better off. But if you do it with some larger group, if it's ISDA's name on it or the IECA or some other entity, it can carry both more weight and also make it less look like you're trying to find a loophole for your organization, but more like it's more that you're pursuing something that is of value to the entire industry.
Very good points. I think we now have time for a few questions from the floor, if we have some brave people.
Yeah, good morning. Really, really great presentation. Given that some of us have work for companies that are not headquartered in the United States, and given your individual and collective expertise on the U.S. regs, how do you work with your headquarters to get the buy-in that one, the U.S. regs are very important, and also that you probably have the best insight in how to craft a compliance framework to deal with them?
So I have a thought on this where, from our perspective, it wasn't. I would say the concern was more reverse, that there was perhaps a greater concern. And one of the things that one of the board of directors kind of confided to me, said that, the DOJ will arrest people on foreign soil. The FCA won't do that, ESMA won't do that, other entities won't do that. So there was a lot of hesitancy in opening up the U.S. office and building the U.S. presence, because there was this concern about, will the DOJ try to pierce the corporate veil to get to our parents' assets? Would the directors for our parent have some sort of personal liability? So there actually wasn't a concern that people would ignore the U.S. regulation, but really a concern that we would over-comply in a way that would make it difficult to operate in our marketplace.
I mean, keep in mind that a significant amount, maybe much of it, of commodities trading happens on U.S. exchanges. So U.S. regulations matter regardless of where you sit. And as do, obviously, European, Germany, has got a significant presence because of the EEX and energy markets there and the location of EEX in Germany. So I don't think that, because our headquarters is in UK, which is interesting and probably our lightest, in a sense, regulatory oversight, because so much of the business that we are doing are engaged on trading that happens in exchanges that are headquartered in the United States, some in UK, others in Asia. So you do, it's a matter of, it does, so in a sense, the business itself, the industry itself is global. So it actually doesn't matter where the head of compliance sits, to be honest with you. What does matter is that the program covers where the business touches.
And this is actually, this is actually where tone at the top is really important. And so maybe the best gift that you could ever have in an international organization is to have one of your heads of business called in for a voluntary interview with the CFTC, because they will then sing the praises of understanding the US system more than anyone else.
I think we had another question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. How do you deal with the fact that some rules have to be imposed globally with the culture in some geographies, in which, for instance, the use of some IT tools, communication tools, in some countries, well, it's easier to impose those rules, but in others, the way to make business with that tool is it's business as usual.
You're asking about ephemeral communications, WhatsApp, WeChat, etc. It is very difficult. You need to, so one thing that you can do that we have done is we actually took a survey across the geographies to determine what tools they use, so we could understand that and try to, and apart from a data protection regime and perspective, which is a very useful way to look into those organizations to understand what communications you can preserve and not, but then to have very clear procedures implemented in those jurisdictions so as to preserve as much as you can that is in scope. But really it's about that. It's a very frequent outreach combined with, it depends on your organization. We have a very, I don't know, varies the term, but we have a relatively embedded compliance program internationally with local compliance officers and coordinators driving that message.
Same. I think certainly, obviously ephemeral communication is always a challenge. And in certain industries, as an example, in China, everyone uses WeChat. You have to use WeChat. The government uses WeChat. Also in China, when you are establishing a data center or a server in China, the government also oversees that, monitors it. You need to be aware of that. It is, I think there's definitely differences. So some of it is selling to the business the importance and their personal interest in why, in either using the tools that you use normally in a way that we can retain records. It can go back to long ago instance of, we had a situation where there was an individual who long departed, who was engaged in a communication with a customer client in an unnamed country that is challenged, and the individual was leaving, but he had shared some conversations on WhatsApp with a client, and then that client, unknown to us, that client then forwarded that WhatsApp communication to the company. And so I use that as an example all the time with traders to say, it's in your best interest to have us record what you're doing, because you can defend it. It's better for us to know what you say than for someone else to send it to us, because it has happened. So if you can get buy-in in that way as to kind of, why am I doing this? Why am I recording your conversations? Why am I, why do we have these data protection, or why are we using your personal data? So if you understand the why, then you're less likely to fight me with respect to the policy.
I'll say it's another reason you might want to record too is, oral transactions are quite common within, if you're doing swaps and derivatives transactions, they can be enabled. And so you could say, well, listen, we want to make sure that we have documentation in the event we have a counterparty that sends us a confirmation saying that you've agreed to sell this, this many units at this price. We want to make sure that we can, adequately determine whether that transaction in fact occurred, because sometimes you may have someone say, well, no, we were negotiating, that wasn't meant to be final, and that's where you want to have the record as opposed to your counterparty having all of the information.
All right, thank you very much. Well, we've actually reached the end of the session, so thanks a lot to all three of you for your insights. That was really, really interesting. And thanks to the audience for their questions and participation in the polls. Let's give them a big round of applause, please.